Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digging Deeper series. I can take that off of there. Welcome again to the Digging Deeper series with the Friends of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center. I'm Amy David, and I'm coming at you live from the Sawtooth Mountains on behalf of the Friends of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center. Wow, what a storm we just had this last week. If any of you are like me and my friends, I'm sure you are trying to find as much free time as possible to go and chase that snow and go and enjoy the new fresh powder that we have here locally. And tonight is the perfect night to brush up on a few key factors that can help make safe decisions in the backcountry, especially when we have a spicy snowpack like we do right now. So tonight we will hear from long-term forecaster Chris Lundy. He will lead a discussion on going beyond the human factors. We've all learned that human factors are often the main cause of avalanche accidents. So what can we do about it? We'll leave that to Chris, and I'll introduce him to start sharing that presentation here shortly. But first, we had a few other things we wanted to share with you while we've got all of you here on Zoom. So the Digging Deeper presentations, if you haven't seen them before, are scheduled for every other Wednesday. And you can mark your calendars for the next Digging Deeper presentation for February 17th, where Scott Savage will give an in-depth talk on persistent and deep slab avalanches. We want to send a huge thank you out to the board of the Friends of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center and the staff, and as a huge, mega huge thank you to the forecaster team for putting in so much work to help gather so much information and put it out in a way that we can all understand and utilize when we go out into the backcountry. So thank you to everybody involved with all of that. Speaking of the Friends, it's a nonprofit organization that contributes over 50% of the operating budget for the Avalanche Center annually, in addition to providing free and low-cost education and outreach opportunities throughout Idaho. A large portion of these funds normally come from our in-person community fundraising events. And as we all are well aware of, we haven't been able to gather in person like we have in the past, which we're very excited to hopefully in the future here soon. But for now, we have greatly appreciated all of the contributions that have come in through the community as donations to help run an organization that can benefit so many of us. So if you're in a place where you can donate, we have a few different ways you can do so. On the website at sawtoothavalanche.com, there's a donate button up in the corner for PayPal. And then we also set up a Venmo account for the Friends of the Avi Center. And you can find that at Sawtooth-Avalanche on Venmo. And yeah, we're trying to make it easy to have different ways that people can contribute. We greatly appreciate anything. So be sure to keep up to date with our upcoming events and the daily avalanche information, some behind the scenes updates from the forecasters by following along on Sawtooth Avi and tagging what you see in the mountains so that we can share that with the whole community of what's going on in different places throughout the forecast zones. So we'd like to send another huge thank you to Chuck with McU Sports out of Boise. They are our official sponsor for tonight's show, and we greatly appreciate Chuck and the entire team at McU Sports for supporting our virtual presentations. So I'm going to let Chuck take the floor for a few to say hello as our event sponsor.
Thanks, I appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here. I'm doing this unscripted and not a real good public speaker, but really want to say thank you and give huge shout outs to what you guys are doing. Hopefully people will be able to donate to Venmo and go from there. But we're just a retail store, which some people are familiar with. We've been around for coming up on 50 years and hope to be here a long time, from here. But we're definitely seeing an uptick in the backcountry use in terms of gear sales at our store. We need to figure out a way to promote it to make sure that people do it safely and smartly. There's Chris has come down and done a bunch of in-store informational avalanche intros at our place the last couple of years, and the bottom line is it's taking a class, being smart and being safe about everything. With COVID going on, people are getting outside more and more and more, and we got to make sure they keep doing it smartly, without a doubt. So we definitely encourage taking any kind of classes that you can. We really appreciate the opportunity to be involved with this. So that's about all that I got, but come see us. And if there's anything that we can help you out with, let us know. Definitely.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. We really appreciate it. And thanks for spreading the word about education and outreach for all those new backcountry users.
You bet.
All right, so moving on for tonight's talk for the Digging Deeper series. If you have questions during the presentation, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and you can type out your question. And then if there's a time where it makes sense, I'll interrupt Chris and ask him that question. Otherwise, we will make sure that we get all the questions answered after the presentation. And if you would like to ask live, you can do the raise hand feature, which is also at the bottom of the screen. You can click that little hand and then we will unmute you and you can ask the question live. And it's a kind of a fun way to try and build a little more interaction so that we can feel like we're, in the room together, but try and make the Zoom a little more interactive. So if you have questions, please feel free to type any of them in or do the raise hand. And I'll let Chris elaborate a little more if there's a way that makes that easier for him as he's presenting. So for tonight's show, Chris Lundy, our long-term and local forecaster and avalanche expert, he's going to talk about going beyond the human factors. So I'll let you take it away from here, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Amy, for the introduction. Thanks a ton, Chuck and McU Sports for supporting this and helping to spread the word about avalanche safety down in Boise. And thanks to all you guys that are out there at home or wherever you are tuning in via Zoom. Appreciate you being here. And as Amy mentioned, we can make this more interesting for everybody by making it more interactive, by asking questions. And please ask questions either by raising your hand and then Amy will unmute you, or you can also chat a question via the Q&A section. So don't worry about interrupting me. I'm pretty happy to answer questions whenever, and it just makes it more easy and more interactive for everybody. And I'm not just talking to myself or to my computer all night. So thanks in advance for the questions and we'll get rolling. So as we usually do with these Digging Deepers, we'll start with a quick conditions update on what we're seeing in the backcountry and then dive into the main program for the evening. This pretty much summarizes the conditions we've had. 4 feet of new snow on Baldy, pretty crazy. 52-inch storm total that fell between last Wednesday through Friday, and pretty major storm. So no surprise that when we get the biggest storm totals in the area of our forecast zones that have the weakest snowpack, that all hell tends to break loose. So we had a pretty exciting period there. We had 3.5 days with an avalanche warning, which is very unusual for us. We had widespread avalanche activity that diminished, and that's relatively speaking. As you head further north, where a bit less snow fell in that storm. There was at least 3 human triggered slides in the Baldy out of bounds, including one on the Scorpion out of bounds run right above the base of Warm Springs that buried a truck and actually hit a structure there. So a lot of excitement around town, really driving anywhere in the Wood River Valley. You could look up in the mountains and see an avalanche. And then with another round of snowfall last night, which was only about 4 to 6 inches in the Wood River Valley, ranging up to 8 to 10 in the northern Sawtooths, that amount of snow and some wind triggered another round of natural avalanches. We'll show a few pictures of those here. If you haven't been on our new avalanche list, I encourage you to do so. But I did a little search from January 27th until today, and that turned up 46 avalanche records. And if we total up all those numbers, that ends up being 119 avalanches. And that is a small fraction of what happened. Those are only avalanches that we saw or that were reported, and we're still entering them. Like, we still have them in our notebooks. We still have photos, and it's just going to take time for us to get caught up and get those all entered. So well over 100 avalanches were seen, and hundreds of avalanches occurred as a result of that major storm. So just going to run through some quick eye candy here. For regular followers of the avalanche forecast, you might have already seen this, a lot of these photos. This photo is of Scorpion, which is right above the base of Warm Springs, out of bound terrain on Baldy. Skier triggered this avalanche. It ran down and almost completely buried a truck and hit a house there at the base of Warm Springs. We heard of a number of slides being triggered in the burn area, heading down into Warm Springs. This is a photo taken a couple days after the fact, but showing a pretty significant large avalanche running down through the burn, down towards Warm Springs Canyon that you can see below. Unsure if this was a natural or a triggered slide. This is an avalanche we saw at the top of Triple Peak. And interesting thing about this is you can see some old ski tracks to the lookers left of that slide that likely the tracks were likely put down during the storm, and then this thing avalanched naturally and ended up covering the ski tracks. This is in the Elkhorn area near Sun Valley, and interesting thing here is you look closely at the photo, you can see a track here, most likely an elk track. But hard to say, could possibly be a ski track. It looks like whoever walked or skied through that start zone triggered a few slides and was pretty lucky to make it out of there. This is a natural avalanche that occurred above Baker Lake. This has been on the avalanche forecast for several days now. This avalanche broke about 2 feet thick and broke on the old snow surface that existed prior to the storm and broke over 1,000 feet wide. Now, with a little bit of new snow last night and a little bit of wind, we saw some new and fresh avalanches. These were just reported today. This is out in the kind of central valley between Haley and Ketchum. This is out at the head of Eagle Creek, north of Ketchum. Really wide propagation there. Want to see more slides? Be sure to check out the media gallery on our website. You can see all kinds of photos from recent avalanche activity. So this storm really hit the reset button on what we're dealing with in the snowpack. And when you get anywhere from 3 to 4 feet of snow in the backcountry, we're really starting over and going back to ground zero to understand what we're left with after that storm. So we have a weak layer that's buried pretty deeply now that we've been concerned with since December. That's the one we've been talking about all year. And we now have new weak layers that are buried beneath the recent storm snow. So it'll take some time to get out in all the different areas of our forecast area and all the different zones and kind of get into the snowpack, get our heads in the snow and see how all that's behaving. So going forward, it's going to take time to reassess that snowpack. Once now that the storm is over, we have several weak layers buried 2 to 4 feet deep. So for most of the year, we've been concerned with one widespread weak layer, and now we have multiple layers to be concerned about. And we're going to have dangerous avalanche conditions for some time. I think Ben at the Avalanche Center put it pretty well when he said, we went from an ugly but simple snowpack to an ugly and complex snowpack. So Ben with a nice shot of optimism there. And he was putting his money where his mouth is, and he was out in the East Fork of the Big Wood today, kind of near the junction where East Fork splits off into Hyndman Creek, and remotely triggered this large avalanche from the ridge line about where the text is in the photo. And when he remotely triggered this from the ridge, he also remotely triggered at the same time, triggered some avalanches that were quite some distance away. So pretty clear indication that the snowpack is still very, very unstable. So before we launch into the meat of the talk tonight, are there any questions about the conditions or just what this last storm did? So we'll just pause for a few seconds. If you have some questions, put them in the Q&A, or if you're feeling brave, please just raise your hand and we can call on you and unmute you. Okay, no questions on conditions apparently. So we're gonna keep rolling. So the bulk of,
Oh, Chris, we just got one that came through.
awesome.
Last minute sliding in. All right, Christopher is asking, what are factors of weak snowpack? New to it all, so just trying to understand.
Well, getting back to, yeah, good question, Chris. It's always helpful to go back to the ingredients we need to have in order for conditions to be unstable. We need to have a slab over a weak layer of snow. So a slab is just some snow that's relatively stronger than the weaker snow below. So once we have those slab and weak layer conditions, that can lead to an unstable snowpack. The next ingredient we need is a slope that's steep enough to avalanche. So we've had a couple of weak layers, or maybe one primary weak layer most of the year up until recently, and that was formed during a long dry spell in mid-December. That's been a weak layer that has been a concern all year. Every time we get a snowfall on it, it's produced avalanche activity, and we've had a number of many natural avalanches and quite a few human triggers as well. In the Wood River Valley, that weak layer has been the weakest due to lack of snow. So the snowpack there has been shallow. The snow has become the weakest in the entire forecast area. And then this last storm dropped the most snowfall in that same area where the weak layer is the weakest. So the slab came in the form of that 4 feet of snow that fell over 3 days on top of that weak layer, and pretty no-brainer conditions. It produced a number of natural avalanches. And due to the nature of these persistent weak layers that are in the snowpack, we're going to have some dangerous conditions for some time. And which is really no news this year. It's been a pretty dangerous year overall. It's really been a pretty exceptional year overall as far as the danger has been concerned and as far as our weak layers. Amy, looks like there's another question. Just
Yeah,
popped
someone's heading into the Pioneer year and asking for any tips or conditions related to the Pioneer Mountains.
Yeah, let's go back, because this avalanche that Ben Vanden Boos with the Avalanche Center remotely triggered today is, I'm not exactly sure where this is, but it's probably within about 5 miles of the Pioneer Yurt. So this is avalanches are the #1 indicator of unstable conditions. So no doubt that up at the Pioneer Yurt, avalanche conditions are going to be very dangerous. So it's really pretty simple. It's avalanche terrain avoidance. So you're going to want to avoid terrain steeper than 30 degrees, and you're really going to want to pay attention to what's above you too. And that's been a pretty remarkable fact this year that we've been harping on the avalanche forecast nearly every day, is that given the nature of our snowpack with these really bad persistent weak layers, remote triggers are a real possibility. So a remote trigger is when you are not on the slope that you trigger. So in this case, Ben was on a safe spot up on the ridge crest where he collapsed the snowpack, and that collapse propagated down into something that was steep enough to slide. So this just made for an exciting event and some great photography. However, you could have triggered this avalanche from down below as well. And obviously that's a much more dangerous situation. So when remote triggers are a possibility, we want to be paying attention to not just the terrain that we're on, but also the terrain that is above us. So yeah, long story short, going into the Pio Yurt, be really careful and basically avoid avalanche terrain.
I think that covers us for questions here, unless anyone has more.
All right, you guys, thank you for chiming in. Okay, so let's dive into tonight's presentation, which is on beyond human factors. So we all know that we're the problem, but what can we do about it? So I'm going to start this off by just reviewing and giving an introduction to human factors. I think anybody who's taken any avalanche course has probably been introduced to human factors. But we're just going to kind of go back in history and see where human factors came from, and then talk about F.A.C.E.T.S. That's a common acronym used surrounding human factors, and then talk about how human factors play a role and tie into just more general human psychology. So once we understand this will lay a framework for moving forward and talking about how to manage these human factors. So it was I think it's always been recognized that human decision making was a big part of the equation, but in Doug Fessler and Jill Fredston's book Snow Sense that came out in 1984, I believe they were the first ones to actually use the term human factors in relation to snow and avalanche accidents. And then Dale Atkins about 20 years ago put out a paper, and he was the editor for the Snowy Torrents, which were a publication that's still going on that looks at all the different avalanche accidents that have happened in the US. And he, after looking at that data, he concluded that 80% of avalanche accidents are due to decision-making errors, not like subtleties of the snowpack or terrain. So basically, people are getting caught in avalanches and having accidents because they're making bad decisions, not because they misunderstand the snowpack or the terrain. Ian McCammon is an avalanche researcher and educator, and he was a huge part of the whole human factor movement. He came up with he was sort of the first one to really popularize the idea of heuristic traps. He did that in 2002. And then he put some of those common heuristic traps into the F.A.C.E.T.S acronym in 2004. So I think he was really one of the people that really pushed forward this idea of human factors and gave us some of the more common educational tools that you might have encountered in learning about human factors. And he was, instrumental in understanding these factors. But then in 2009, he went on to say that simply knowing about human factors will not alone be sufficient to prevent future accidents. So even he recognized that, recognition is half the battle, but there's still another half of the battle that needs to be fought in order to actually reduce the amount of avalanche accidents. So this is his F.A.C.E.T.S acronym, and I bet a lot of you have seen this in avalanche classes, and we'll just breeze through this pretty quickly. But all these letters stand for common heuristic traps that people might fall into in the backcountry. And it's important to note that these aren't specific to the avalanche world at all. These are related to common heuristic traps that are identified in other decision-making scenarios and just more kind of common life situations. And they're actually used, as many have heard, are used in marketing as well, to get us to do what marketers want us to do. Familiarity is a common one. We tend to feel more comfortable when we're in terrain that we've been in before. Acceptance, we always like to have people like us. We don't want to be the person that speaks up and ruins the day for everybody by saying this is a bad idea. We're just generally looking for our fellow humans to accept and like us. C stands for commitment or consistency. Basically, once we make a plan, it's hard for us to deviate from that plan. So we end up getting committed to that plan and tend to proceed with those plans, even if there's evidence or data to the contrary. Expert halo, it's pretty easy to listen to and put maybe undue emphasis on people that we feel are more skilled than we are or have more knowledge. T stands for tracks, as in getting first tracks. And this relates to a common heuristic trap called scarcity, where we put more value on things that are of limited, that have some sort of limited availability. And finally, S stands for social proof. So basically, we feel that things, or it's our human nature to feel that things are more or more safe when other people are doing them. So we see tracks on a slope, we see people doing certain things on social media. That makes us feel better about doing them ourselves. So we're going to do a quick poll here, and I want you guys to look at these, and you maybe you've already done this in other Avalanche classes, but look at these different human factors and think about which one is kind of the biggest one in your world, which one you might be most susceptible to. And you should see a poll pop up, and go ahead and just vote for the one that you think is you're most susceptible to. Well, let's give you guys a little bit of time to do this and see how the results pile up. Okay, just a couple more seconds here. Okay, thanks you guys for voting, and interesting results here. It looks like, actually, I think I could share these results. So I think you should be able to see these now, but you can see that 43% of people think that familiarity is their Achilles heel when it comes to human factors, with expert halo being the second there. It looks like a pretty overwhelming majority of people picked familiarity. And I was going to share that I think familiarity is probably my Achilles heel as well, especially when I think about being on the job and when I'm going out in the field for gathering information for the avalanche forecast. We tend to go to a lot of the same spots over and over. And some of the close calls that I've had have been going to areas that I'm familiar with, but I didn't recognize that conditions were different than when I'd been there previously, and I didn't behave differently based on those different conditions. So once we started thinking a lot about human factors, people started thinking like, hey, wait, isn't this just human psychology? Like, are we making, are we trying to give special emphasis on basically behavior that is just, human, that we're just being normal humans? And it turns out that humans make kind of poor decisions in a lot of aspects of life for a lot of the same reasons. And this sort of thinking started about the same time some popular mainstream books came out about decision making. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a pretty common and cited book. It's a pretty tough read, but it's definitely worth kind of reading or skimming. But in that book, he introduces, and this really wasn't his original idea, but I think he kind of popularized this concept of two different ways that we make decisions and the way that we think. The first one is what he called System 1, which is what we commonly think as intuitive thinking. And it's a fast thinking system. It's largely unconscious, and it's looking for answers that are good enough. And it's best when time is critical, when the situation is complex, and when we have incomplete information. In contrast, we have the System 2 analytical or rational approach. And this is slow, it takes effort, and it's looking for the best answer. And it's best when we have plenty of time, when data is clear cut, and when it's a straightforward situation. So I don't think there's any surprise which one of these types of decision-making processes really dominates in the backcountry. If we think about what's happening in the backcountry, we often are feeling rushed. The time is critical. The situation is certainly complex, and we don't always have all the information we want. And sometimes the questions we ask ourselves aren't even answerable, given our knowledge of the snowpack. So System 1, intuitive decision-making, really dominates when we're in the backcountry. And this isn't really by any choice of ours. This is just what we naturally do based on our human psychology. And it's understanding this fact that really sort of lays the basis and framework for understanding human factors. So in the backcountry, when the situation is so complex, we tend to trust our gut. So while intuitive decision making tends to dominate in the backcountry, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we were, purely rational creatures, we would be totally paralyzed in the backcountry. There's so many decisions and things that we have to make. Just every few minutes, we're having to make some decision. And if we had to think carefully and slowly and gather all the information about each of those decisions, we would never leave the trailhead. So intuitive thinking is not a bad thing. The trouble is that it leads to a number of traps and biases and shortcuts. And that can, especially in the backcountry environment, that can lead to avalanche accidents. Oh, and there's one other problem that we need to discuss here. Yep, that's the problem. Powder skiing, powder riding. That's a whole nother part of this equation. And recent research has shown that when we're partaking in it's sports that might be risky, so they're causing adrenaline. Maybe they're really, really pleasurable, so they're causing endorphins. So they're producing this chemical cocktail in our brain. And when that happens, it is literally impossible to be making a rational decision under those conditions. So that's a whole nother component of this human factors. So it's important to know the thing we're all going out there and seeking is a major part of the problem. I just came across this in the Avalanche Review, and this is a quote by Doug Krause, and I really liked it. And I think it really sets the tone for this presentation. But it turns out that we're not just a factor, we are the factor when it comes to avalanche problems. So what do we do about it? So that sort of wraps up just a brief introduction and history about human factors. It should have been reviewed for a lot of you. So let's move on and talk about what we can do to combat those human factors. So that first part, every time I read about human factors, it does get a little discouraging because really we're bumping up against our fundamental human nature, and it can be a little bit frightening and we can feel a little hopeless at times. But there is some good news. And the good news is that, and I would say just in the last 10 years, although that number is maybe a little bit arbitrary or up for discussion, but I think in the last 10 years, we've made some progress in developing some tools for combating human factors. I think the biggest challenge now isn't necessarily how, or like what tools to use, it's to actually get people to use them. I think that's the big challenge now. And I think part of the problem is that, and some of it we're just overcoming a long time culture of being able to, I was raised in an avalanche culture where you went out and you gathered all your observations, you did whatever the latest fancy snowpack test was, you looked at the snowpack layers, you got your snow science dialed in, you did all those things, so you understood the snowpack, you knew exactly what was happening in the snowpack, and then you made rational decisions based on that information. And I call this the mountain ninja approach. And for those of you that have seen other presentations I've done, this may seem like a familiar concept. But there's just this culture that we can be these mountain ninjas running around, doing all these fancy tests, looking at the snowpack, and then making perfectly rational decisions about it. And it's really, some of this is tied to our ego, especially those of us that have been doing this for a long time. We have a really hard time giving up this concept that one, all this information and education we've had over the years is being tempered by our human psychology, and even in some ways completely thwarted. So I think once we can get away from this mountain ninja concept and and be a little bit more humble and understand that our human psychology sort of puts us at a disadvantage in making good decisions, and use some of these, somewhat simplistic tools to help us make better decisions. I think the sooner we can do that, the better we will be in eventually overcoming human factors. So I think the biggest step in overcoming human factors is just a willingness to put aside our egos and to use some sort of somewhat simplistic tools to help us make better decisions. So there's a lot of different things that we can do to combat human factors, and I just compiled a list of 6 things that came to my mind that seem to be really important in what I've learned over the years. And this is just for me personally, not just for me personally, but in having taught a lot of people and looked at a lot of avalanche accidents, and just some of the information and knowledge I've gained over the years. There's a lot of other factors that other folks might list, but I thought I'd just throw out 6 of sort of my favorite things to help combat human factors. So we'll go through each of these in turn and see how these all play a role. The first and the most important, and really where all this starts, is getting to know yourself. So this lays the foundation for everything else. And if you don't have a great self-awareness of what makes you tick, you're gonna have a really hard time overcoming human factors and putting the rest of these tools to use. So here are some factors that you can think about, when you try to get to know yourself when it pertains to making decisions in the backcountry. Even those of us that think we don't have much of an ego, all of us have some sort of ego, and it's important to understand how this is playing a role in our decisions. Ego can lead to a lot of biases in our decision making, and it can cause it can lead to sort of various motivations for being out in the backcountry, and ego really can make us turn a blind eye to what's happening. It's important to understand our risk tolerance and to reevaluate this over the course of our life, because risk tolerance is definitely a thing that changes. It tends to decrease as we get older. It can decrease with life events like getting married and having kids. So it's important to understand that. It's important to reevaluate that. And it's important to be truly honest about that. And a lot of people think of risk tolerance as being a really individual thing. And in some ways it is, but you need to be thinking about the people that care about you as well. So don't just be selfish with your risk tolerance. You might not have a spouse, you might not have kids, you might not have people that depend on you. There's still a lot of people in the world that care about you. So risk tolerance shouldn't just be a selfish thing. You should be thinking about all the other folks that are in your world. What are your biases? What are your motivations? What makes you tick? What makes you get out in the backcountry? Are you going out there and seeking the kind of train you do because it's really what you enjoy, or because it's what you're seeing other people do on social media? And it's once you understand yourself, and I shouldn't say that once you understand yourself, because you may never understand yourself completely. I think it's a lifelong process. But once you start asking yourself these questions, you start trying to look at the answers in your partners as well. And so it's really important to kind of be thinking about some of these factors with your partners. In that same Avalanche Review article, Doug Krause says, it turns out it's not about being a better person. It's not about being a better avalanche person. It's about being a better person. And I think this really hit home for me. And I think really says it all when it comes down to the knowing yourself. So this might sound harsh, but if you have some friend that's kind of a junk show in their normal life, they're going to be a potentially tough partner in the backcountry as well. And it turns out that people that are really good people tend to be good backcountry partners as well. Next on the list was having a process. For those of you that have taken an avalanche course in the last 5 to 10 years, having some kind of planning process tends to be the backbone of these avalanche courses. And so it doesn't really matter what course you took, doesn't matter the process you learned. The important thing is that you have a process, and that it's something you get in the habit of doing. It's a ritual, it's repeatable, and this can really help combat some of those human factors by just getting into a practice of going through this process day in and day out. And like I said, there's not really a right or wrong process, but I just thought I'd share with you a process that has worked for me over the years. And this is the one I've used, whether I've been out recreational skiing back in the days when I was guiding, and it's still what I use when I'm heading out in the field for avalanche forecasting. I start by checking the avalanche conditions, and that's there's a lot more to that, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. And that's something I'm doing daily. You know, even if I'm not going out in the backcountry, I'm checking on the avalanche conditions. Then I make a terrain plan based on those conditions, and we'll touch on that in the next point about combating human factors. Then I choose good partners and make sure we all have the appropriate equipment. And, you know, avalanche rescue equipment is really a given for the people I'm heading out in the field with, but also just discussing, you know, who has what as far as group equipment, who has first aid, who has a repair kit, who's got some kind of communication device, and so on. Once I'm in the field, I make observations, and once I'm in the field, we're making observations and asking those questions the observations are really trying to answer the question, are conditions as expected? So am I seeing something that I was not expecting? If that's the case, then I might take a step back. If we're basically seeing what we're expecting to see, then we can proceed with the plan. And once we proceed with that plan, and maybe we start exposing ourselves to avalanche terrain, we're going to minimize exposure through you know, only skiing or riding one at a time, and always paying attention to the consequences of any time we commit ourselves to avalanche terrain. So what's going to happen to me if this thing slides? How big is the slide going to be? And so forth. And then finally, at the end of the day, we're going to debrief and discuss whether we made good decisions that day. So this is a process that's worked for me over the years. Getting to the checking the conditions. Again, this is part of the process that I just do every day. It's just a ritual. And I almost always do it in this order, but I look at the observations, so basically all the information that other people have sent in. So just kind of looking at the raw data of what people are seeing in the backcountry. Then I look at the past weather, the current weather, and the weather forecast. And then I look at the avalanche forecast. So by doing these things and doing them in that order every day, it gives me a pretty good picture, an ongoing picture of what's happening over the course of the winter. And, you know, because it's my job at the Avalanche Center, I'm looking at all this information, you know, over a large spatial area, like our whole forecast area. But if there's certain places that you go to on a regular basis, I encourage you to check out our trip planner tool. You just click on the map on our homepage, and it gives you basically all this information, but for a specific area, so you're not so overwhelmed with all the different information. Okay, the next thing that I think can help combat human factors is knowing where not to go. And I don't know if any of you guys have checked out the website Powder Cloud, but it's a pretty cool news site that has some great avalanche education articles. And one I was reading recently by Colin Zacharias, who is a longtime Canadian avalanche educator, researcher, guide. He's really done it all. He's definitely one of the gurus out there. He had this really simple statement to make in this article. He said, knowing where not to go is the most important backcountry decision you'll ever make. A lot of us are trying to think about where we want to go on a given day. But before we can answer that question, we need to know where not to go. And I think one really this kind of goes back to knowing yourself, but I think one important factor in answering this question is knowing what's the default terrain on any given day. What kind of terrain does your brain default to? I think a lot of folks on any given day, they're going to default to going into steep avalanche terrain because that's what they want to do. And if they see like an overwhelming amount of evidence saying they shouldn't do that, then that might convince them not to go there, and they might choose mellower terrain. And you know, you can argue that if the end result is going to the right terrain, that's not really a bad approach. But I do think it sort of sets you up in the wrong direction. over the years, one thing that I found really helpful is now my default terrain on any given day has become non-avalanche terrain. So without any additional information, that's going to be my default go-to. So on any given day, the answer to the question is where am I not going to go is avalanche terrain. Now, once I start gathering information based on what we just talked about in that process, I can start deciding if there's an overwhelming amount of information indicating that it would be safe to kind of step out into steeper terrain. And it may, there might be overwhelming amount of evidence pointing to the fact that I could step out into, maybe pretty simple avalanche terrain, maybe getting into stuff in the low 30s slope angle. But I'm only going to go into very steep primetime avalanche terrain when I am very sure that that's an appropriate decision. Otherwise, I'm just going to fall back. If there's any question in my mind, if there's any uncertainty about whether or not that makes sense, I'm going to fall back to my default terrain, which is just keeping it mellow yellow. Along the lines of knowing where not to go, this is a good quote that really stuck with me from the human factor piece Powder Magazine did. This was a number of years ago now, but I really like this quote. No matter how much experience we have, no matter how much knowledge and understanding, we're still prone to making bad decisions in the field. And so we need to find ways to take emotion and intuition out of decision making. The way to do that, it seems, is based on successful risk mitigation strategies developed in other high-risk industries and activities, is to take high consequence decision making out of the field. In other words, to make rules. And I think this sentence I just highlighted here is the take-home point, that we need to take high consequence decision-making out of the field as much as possible. And this gets back to when is knowing where we don't want to go before we even head out into the field. So in order to do this, we need to define some rules and boundaries with our partners before we head out. And this can be pretty general. This is a good place to start. We can start with the terrain type. So we can choose non-avalanche terrain, simple terrain, challenging, complex. There's a whole terrain scale here that's based on the avalanche terrain and exposure scale developed in Canada. If you wanted to learn more about this, you can search A.T.E.S, ATES, search that online and you'll find some information about that. But just coming up with the terrain type can be a general way to set rules and boundaries on where we're not going to go. And then we can say also that we're not going to go to certain drainages or basins or venues. Maybe there's a particular drainage we like to ride in, but we know that it doesn't have the type of terrain that we need for the day, that maybe it's all just steep, complex terrain and there's no more simple options. So we can rule out whole drainages and basins. At a certain point, we want to get more specific with some of these rules and boundaries. We want to start thinking about what kind of slope angles we feel comfortable riding in. So maybe given the current avalanche problems that we have out in the backcountry right now, we want to stick to slope angles that are less than 30 degrees. So basically we're avoiding avalanche terrain. Under certain circumstances, the avalanche problems might be very aspect dependent. So maybe we say that we're going to avoid north aspects due to a weak layer that's only exists on those aspects. Also, certain terrain characteristics might be used as rules and boundaries. With a deep slab problem, we might say we're going to avoid terrain that is rocky or wind loaded or has various trigger points. Eventually, we want to get very specific, and we want to talk about, exact, like once we decide where we're going, talk about exact areas within that spot that we're going to avoid. So like we're not going to touch certain death bowl, even though this place we're going is right below certain death bowl. We're going to look up at it. It's going to look good, but we're going to decide that we're not going to go there on that day. The next way we can try to reduce the influence of human factors is by improving our communication and teamwork. A few different ways to do this. One is to start conversations with conditions, not terrain. A lot of times when I've called up my partners and started talking about what we want to do on a given day, we start by talking about where we're going to go. We launch into talking about terrain choices before we've even discussed conditions. So I always start your conversations with conditions. And once there's a consensus amongst you and your partners about what's happening, then you can move on to terrain. I think it's really important, especially in our sort of type A driven, faster, further backcountry culture that seems to be evolving, is to just slow down a little bit. And we need to make sure that we're taking time to discuss things with our partners in the backcountry. It's so easy just to get in the groove and you're just motoring along. Everybody's out of breath on the up track. Nobody has any energy or breath to talk. You get to the top and it's who can transition the fastest. And then pretty soon you're off and there hasn't even been a discussion about what's happening. If you're riding a snowmobile, it can be the same thing. You're isolated from your partners a lot of the time because you're out buzzing around, playing around. And when you stop, you might have your helmets on. Makes for tough communication. So it's important to stop, regroup, take your helmets off and discuss what you're seeing and what you guys think about your plan. There tends to be two types of people in groups. There's those that have no trouble kind of speaking up and speaking their mind, and there's those that are more quiet and tend to keep to themselves. And whichever you are, it's really important for you to either, if you're one of those that are always kind of expressing your opinion and tend to be maybe one of the leaders in the group, be sure to engage others and ask their opinion. If you tend to be one of the quieter ones that just seems to just kind of listen to what others have to say, you really need to challenge yourself to speak up. This really goes both ways for whatever your personality type is. But without doing this, it makes communication very, very difficult amongst people with different types of personalities. And there needs to be an unspoken or maybe even spoken agreement within your group that if one person has a problem with what you're doing, that can put the kibosh on the entire plan. You really don't want to be the one that tries to override somebody who's saying no, only to go trigger an avalanche. If somebody says no, that's really important to listen to that because they might have they might have seen something you haven't. They might not even be able to explain why they think it's a bad idea, but it's important to listen to that. Another thing that can really help with teamwork is for somebody to occasionally play the devil's advocate. It's really easy to be the optimist when you're in the backcountry. It's easy to try to convince yourself that things are good, that things are stable, that what you're doing is right. But it's also important to have somebody, and this doesn't need to be the same person all the time, but be the devil's advocate and to be the skeptic in the group and really question why you're making the decision you are. And one other thing and this is just a really simple thing that can help communication, are backcountry radios. And snowmobilers and snow bikers have really embraced these. It's almost uncommon to see people riding without these now. Skiers are getting a little better, but still a little slow to adopt the radio technology. But it's really huge because there are times when you're traveling and moving through the backcountry that you're not all together as a group. And communication can be just as important when you have, and maybe more important when you have one person in the middle of avalanche terrain and everybody else is waiting from a safe spot. And in those conditions, radios are absolutely critical. The fifth recommendation I have kind of ties back to that devil's advocate thing I just mentioned, and that is to perform a pre-mortem. And some of you might have heard of this concept, but it builds on the idea of the post-mortem. So post-mortem is something that's done after an accident to investigate what happened, what went wrong, and what were the factors that led to the accident. So performing a pre-mortem is basically doing an investigation before the accident happens. So we're asking questions like, how will the accident report read? If I drop into this slope and this thing avalanches, what is the accident report going to say? If I drop into this and it avalanches, what are my friends going to say? Are they going to say they should have known better, the idiots? Or are they going to say they did everything right, but they got unlucky? Another way to think about this, I've asked myself this a lot in the backcountry. I've asked myself, do I think this is going to avalanche? And I might say no. But then if I think about it in a little different way, and I ask myself, would I be totally shocked if this avalanched? For me, that's really been a helpful question to ask because it really reframes the question. And a lot of times I might not think it's going to avalanche, but I wouldn't be totally shocked if it did. And if I ever get caught in an avalanche, and it's likely to happen, it's happened before. But if I get caught in an avalanche again, I want the answer to this question to be yes. I want to be totally shocked that that avalanche happened. The last suggestion I have for you guys, as far as helping to combat human factors, is playing the long game. And I have another poll for you here. So stand by. So this is a really simple question. There's just two answers. Don't think about this one, just look at it and answer. Okay, looks like the voting is slowing down. All right. Thanks for sharing your answer there. So I'm going to share the result. So yeah, this is a little bit of tongue in cheek, but I think it's a pretty good question to ask ourselves. And we can see that this, I want to die in the mountains doing what I love, says almost nobody. We had 8% people answered that was their approach. Some of those might actually feel that way. Some of those might have been kind of smart aleck responses. But the vast majority of people, over 90%, said they want to grow old and die after a lifetime of skiing and riding in powder covered mountains. And I definitely fall into this camp too. And this concept of kind of cumulative risk over many, many days in the backcountry is something I've thought about as I've gotten older, and my days in the backcountry are starting to pile up. And I think it's really important to think about, rather than just the effects of one bad decision, I think it's really critical to think about how a lifetime of mediocre decisions can affect your longevity and your ability to grow old doing these wonderful backcountry sports. So I got a little thought experiment that I want us all to think about. And I thank Scott Savage, the director of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center, for talking me through some of this stuff. I think it's been pretty interesting discussions we've had, and it's really shaped the way I think about this. But let's start with the supposition that, we're looking down some avalanche slope, and we're saying, I'm 90% sure this won't slide. And I would guess that a lot of people actually think like that's reasonably certain that it's not going to slide. Like that's pretty good. A lot of times you don't even feel that good about it. But let's investigate this just a little bit. And I'm going to throw some numbers out here, but I'll do the math for you, so you don't have to think about it too hard. But let's suppose that on the average day of backcountry skiing or riding, that we make one life or death decision per day. And it's a little arbitrary, but after talking to Scott Savage, we kind of concurred that we actually both came upon that number independently. And so that seems pretty reasonable. And let's say you average 30 days in the backcountry a year, and you want to do this for 30 years. So, you might do more or less days in the backcountry. You might hope to do this for 50 or 60 years. So you can change those numbers around, but this keeps the math kind of simple. So that ends up with about 1,000 critical decisions. So if you're right 90% of the time of those 1,000 critical decisions, that means that you're wrong for 100 critical decisions. Okay, so you're probably starting to see where I'm going with this. So 100 wrong decisions over the course of your lifetime in the backcountry is not that great. Like that's likely to lead to some problems. But let's take into account that, you know, everybody says that Mother Nature is so unfriendly. And I argue the exact opposite. Mother Nature, especially when it comes to avalanches, lets us get away with a lot of stuff. And, you know, Bruce Tremper, a fairly famous avalanche forecaster, has been quoted as saying that even when conditions are the most unstable, that 95% of the time you can ski or ride on a slope and it's not going to avalanche. So let's say that 95% of those bad decisions you make, you get a get out of jail free card. So that means out of 100 of those bad decisions, 5 of those life and death decisions could lead to bad outcomes. So over the course of a backcountry career, 5 wrong life and death decisions isn't really that good. You really would be lucky to survive a lifetime of backcountry skiing and riding with that kind of success rate. And that that's going to lead to an accident or worse. So in talking to this with Scotty, we came to this number of, we want this number to be, instead of 5, we want it to be like 0.1. So that's kind of arbitrary. We sort of pulled that out of a hat, but that seemed a sufficiently low risk in the backcountry. So in order to have that 0.1 wrong life or death decisions over the course of a backcountry career that we've described, that means that we need to be 99.8% sure of every decision we make in the backcountry. That is life or death. And I think that helps put it in the perspective that, you know, when we're thinking about making these decisions, we need to be absolutely sure that we're doing the right thing. And that gets back to sort of the default terrain that you go into on any given day. If you default to being a non-avalanche terrain, and then when you're 99.8% sure that it's appropriate to get into steeper terrain, then you can do it and feel good about it and know that, you know, that risk is acceptable. Again, this is just a thought experiment. We don't really ever know when we're 99.8% sure of a decision. But the point being is that we can't just think that it's okay. We need to be really sure. There needs to be an overwhelming amount of evidence that what we're doing is a good thing. And Scott wrapped this up by saying, you know, in the backcountry, when we're thinking about decisions, it's either hell yes, like I know this is a good thing to do, I know it's a good decision, or no way. I think that really sums it up. Hell yes or no way. So as we wrap up here, I just want to summarize these different approaches and different ideas I threw out for combating human factors. And I want you to look through these and think about which one of these might be helpful or might be particularly helpful for you to avoid some of the human traps that we've discussed. So we have know yourself, have a process, know where not to go, improve your communication and teamwork, perform a pre-mortem, and play the long game. So I'm going to throw up one last poll here. And I want you to kind of throw out which one of these you think will be most helpful to you moving forward. Okay, we'll just go a few more seconds here. Jump in there if you haven't voted yet. It's been kind of neck and neck. We need some tiebreakers. Okay, should be able to see the results now. And knowing where not to go was kind of in the lead there, but then having a process took it in the end. So that seems like having a process is maybe the thing that people find the most useful, followed by knowing where not to go. And really those two are tied together. Having a process is an important step in deciding where not to go for any day in the backcountry. So thank you guys so much for your attention tonight. And I would love to open it up to any questions you might have.
Chris, I haven't seen any questions come in just yet, but I could start one off for us.
Sure, fire away.
Okay, so you've clearly been in the backcountry for many years. Where have you seen the most growth for you in combating human factors? Like you personally, over the course of your backcountry career of starting out to now where you're at the Avalanche Center, what have you really focused on working on?
Oh, Amy, you're throwing the tough one out there.
I'm trying to start you off with a good one.
Those points that I threw out there are really the ones that have been the most useful to me. So kind of what I showed is probably the answer to your question. Of those 6, I would say knowing where not to go and deciding that before I go out into the backcountry has been the most useful. Because really, as I said, there's kind of a reluctance amongst people to adopt some of these approaches and to kind of stick with that mountain ninja approach. And I was definitely raised in the mountain ninja culture, going to school for snow science and, taking a number of avalanche education courses and being mentored by some of the top snow scientists in the field. I really was kind of raised, quote, to think that you could outsmart the snowpack and outthink it. And eventually that would lead to being able to get into steeper terrain on any given day. And it was kind of a painful lesson learning that that's not the case. So I think learning where not to go on any given day and trying not to outsmart the snowpack has been the most helpful.
Great. I like that phrase, try not to outsmart the snowpack. All right, looks like we've got some questions rolling in here. Oh yeah, they're coming in fast. All right, so Jason Lloyd is asking, what are some general terrain traversing trips you'd give for people trying to avoid avalanche terrain while making their way towards non-avalanche terrain?
So it sounds like he's trying to get some tips on, let's see, avoiding avalanche terrain. Well, I think there's some things you can do before leaving your house, and this might get to one of the other questions as I kind of look ahead. But I think getting really good and familiar and skilled with some mapping tools, whether it's CalTopo or Gaia, Onyx, whatever mapping tool you like to use, and one that shows some slope angle shading. I think that could help set you up for success in choosing a route, to get somewhere that also avoids avalanche terrain. But as I mentioned, it's not just about the terrain you're on. You have to be thinking about what's above you. So always being kind of on the lookout for terrain that's above you that could potentially avalanche and hit your position, even if you're down in the flats. So yeah, I think just always paying attention to what's around you, not just what you're on as you get to try to get to your non-avalanche terrain.
Great, that answered another question about estimating routes and slope angles. Somebody uses CalTopo for that and is asking if there's other mapping tools.
Yeah,
CalTopo additional.
CalTopo is the classic one that has slope angle, and I think somebody else threw in there that Gaia is a very popular mapping app on your mobile device, and they have their own slope angle shading. One thing that's kind of thrown me for a loop, I looked at CalTopo for years, and for a while Gaia had the CalTopo slope angle shading, but they recently are using their own slope angle shading algorithm. And the coloring scheme is a little different. It's close enough that you might think you're using the familiar CalTopo slope shading, but it's actually different. So I encourage you, if you're using Gaia, to really get familiar with what those colors mean.
It looks like there's a question here from Jackson asking about extended column tests and if there are acceptable or safe results.
No, there's not. This could be a long answer. But I guess going back to having, just trying to put this in the context of what we talked about tonight, going back to having a process is you need to have a process that observations like your snowpack tests fit into. And I think without that process, this is just an example of how certain observations like snowpack tests and other things can really get taken out of context, or we just don't really know how to use them appropriately. So the way that I use snowpack tests when I'm, to help facilitate my backcountry decision-making process is once I'm in the field, I've already have an opinion about what I think is happening out there. And the terrain I've decided not to go to that day has been based on that opinion of the avalanche conditions. So my terrain choices are based on that opinion. So when I'm out in the field, I'm trying to gather observations that either confirm or deny that opinion. And that's where snowpack tests can fall or can help out or can fall into place. So if I do an extended column test, I'm not necessarily thinking about the score. I'm thinking about whether or not it confirms or denies my opinion of what's happening. If it confirms my opinion, like if I think conditions are stable and I do an extended column test and it produces, doesn't propagate, then all that tells me is I'm basically seeing what I expected to see, and I can proceed with my plan. If I end up getting an unstable score and I was expecting to find more stable conditions, then that makes me scratch my head and say, okay, I think my opinion could be incorrect. And it could be incorrect for any number of reasons. But the point is that I'm seeing something I wasn't expecting, and I might need to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate my plan. And maybe step back that terrain plan and maybe go to someplace mellower. So hopefully that makes sense. Like I never would say a snowpack is stable based on one test score, but I might say that conditions are more unstable than I thought based on one poor score.
Well, lots to think about with that answer. Could you talk about human factors and how they relate to decision-making on the side country or the backcountry surrounding ski resorts?
I think, that's kind of a whole nother, there really are like a whole nother set of human factors. I mean, you can use a lot of the ones we talked about, but there's a lot of sort of human factors that play a role just as we're moving from like, quote, safe, sort of the safe, controlled environment of the backcountry or of the ski resort where they've done avalanche mitigation. And we're just like out there, we're just like purely having fun, just ripping around. We're not making decisions, and all of a sudden we're ducking a rope, and now we're, if we take the same attitudes we had in the inbounds, take those out of bounds, it's just a recipe for an accident. We need to be able to slow down. We need to recognize that it's, completely shift our mode of thinking from just, having fun, not making decisions, ripping around the inbounds, to now we have to make backcountry decisions about, terrains and slopes that could kill us. And a lot of times, it's pretty easy to, like, if you've been skiing in bounds and you see that powder out of bounds, now you've completely shortcutted your process potentially. Like maybe you haven't even thought about avalanche conditions. So there's been no process. You haven't decided about terrain that you're not going to go into on that day. So a lot of those things we talked about just never really take place. But I think the biggest factor, if I can try to put this in more concise terms than I've succeeded in doing so far, is just the mental shift of inbounds mentality and a backcountry mentality. They're totally opposite.
Great, thanks for elaborating on that one. There was that was part of a question that I'll follow up more on here. But Ryan was asking about some recent accidents and if you could address those. But that other part of the question was that a lot of experienced skiers and riders seem to be in familiar terrain with that easy access to right out the gates. And that mindset shift seems like a good topic to think about.
Yeah, that's might have caught me a little off guard. We've been so busy here with our own avalanche conditions that I haven't been as up to date on some of the accidents that have happened elsewhere. I did read about the one in Utah most recently and outside of Park City, and there's a lot. It's and like we talked about kind of the beginning of the presentation. It's pretty easy to look at these, look at sort of retrospectively what human factors played a role in these accidents. And I think that can be educational, but that doesn't necessarily prevent us from making the same errors over and over as we've seen, unfortunately. But the one in Utah, that was a pretty familiar slope for those folks. They believe that they had skied that slope before. That was just outside of the boundary. So there's a familiarity. Certainly a big human factor with watching people ski out of bounds is just that social proof. And we watch other people doing it and getting away with it. And maybe we're just seeing it on social media. It's really easy to convince ourselves that that's an okay thing to do. But really, like I said, retrospectively, we can look at those, but is that going to prevent us from making those same errors in the future? And that's where I think it's really important to have some tools to employ to start preventing those human factors from occurring.
Awesome. To follow up on that one, Mark Nagel has a really great question for you. So given a lifetime of exposure, do avalanche professionals typically get more conservative with decision-making over their careers to mitigate human factors? Maybe another way of asking, does your sense of certainty get harder to ascertain with more experience or less?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mark. There's a number of things to touch on there. But really why, like I said, that Scott Savage and I started talking about this, and it really stems back from things that he had thought about quite a bit when he was working as a snow safety worker at Big Sky Ski Resort, and just kind of sort of started to calculate some of his exposure to avalanche risk over time. And I think it became pretty, frankly, scary to him when he started doing the math. I mean, I figured that I think I've been in the backcountry, probably average 75 days over the last 25 years. And that adds up. And that's, there's without a doubt, I've thought a lot about cumulative risk over sort of my backcountry career, and it has made me more conservative. I've definitely have known that I've gotten away with stuff. There's a lot of stuff I got away with that I don't even know about. And I've just started thinking that, at some point it's got to start catching up with you. So it's definitely made me more conservative over time. That's just a lot of time to be out there. And getting to his point about, certainty, the more you know about the snowpack, you don't start feeling better about it, really. I think that's kind of a sort of a disappointing thing for some people to learn once they start getting more avalanche training, that the more you know, sometimes the more you don't know. But it's important to know what you don't know. And especially, since I moved to Idaho, 15 years ago, and started really learning about weak layers. This is a great environment for learning about persistent weak layers. And the more you see them, the more you see some weird stuff. weird stuff happen. You see them behave in ways that are unexpected. And just started getting to the point where as long as those persistent weak layers exist, you just don't feel that great about the snowpack. And that's what has really driven my default terrain selection to become non-avalanche terrain, unless I just feel really, really sure that it's appropriate to step it up from into avalanche terrain.
Great. That was an awesome question, Mark. Thanks for asking. Does anybody else have questions? If you do, we've got a few more minutes with Chris. You can type them into the Q&A box or hit the raise hand button if you'd like to ask live. While we wait for a couple more questions, if anybody is looking to take an avalanche course, we do have an entire listing of the local providers on sawtoothavalanche.com. You can click on the calendar or the education tab, and there's a whole culmination of the different providers to take an avalanche course. Or mark your calendars for the next Digging Deeper on February 17th. And that's going to be with Scott Savage, and he's going to talk to us about deep and persistent slab avalanches. All right, we've got the questions coming back in. So keep them coming if you've got more. All of the questions are great to have coming through here. So one from Ben, he's asking, what makes a good ski partner? How have you found your best partners?
Oh, that's a great question, Ben. I got lucky and married my best ski partner, so I guess I know I got lucky there, but we haven't always been married, so I have been faced with that before, and I think that having a partner, like that first point I made was knowing yourself, and I think having a partner that is self-aware enough to kind of understand their own biases and what their strengths and their weaknesses are. Somebody that has as little ego as possible. I mean, we all have egos, but somebody who's not really ego driven. And then there's really just some of the more compatibility things, like, or do you have similar goals and risk tolerances? Like, do you travel at the same speeds? Do you look for the same terrain? For me personally now, I like to have somebody who is really conservative and has the same attitude that I have, that they're waiting for conditions to be right, and until things are right, we're more than happy to ski and ride on low angle slopes. And then somebody who's committed to the process and committed to being education and having the right equipment and all that. So I think those are some of the factors. And finding them can be hard. It's I feel like a lot of people, especially early on in your backcountry career, end up finding your partners in other avalanche classes. I think it's a great way to meet people, and you have the benefit of having just been taught the same information. So you can start out on the same page and kind of practice the skills that you just learned together. So I think avalanche courses are a great place to learn and meet partners. And I think while you're in sort of the quote test driving phase, like anytime I go out with somebody new that I haven't been out in the backcountry before, that's kind of an unknown commodity, keep it mellow. Those are days where it's probably good, no matter what the avalanche conditions are, to stick to mellow non-avalanche terrain.
Well, shout out to Sarah Lundy, setting the example for being a good ski partner. That was a great question. Speaking of keeping it mellow, we have another question in here asking about where are the best non-avalanche runs? So how can people identify that non-avalanche terrain and still have a good time?
Yeah, this takes a little bit of homework. I think using some mapping programs can be pretty helpful. I mean, there's a lot of fairly obvious non-avalanche terrain on Galena Summit. During periods of high danger, there's no surprise why there's so much traffic up there. There's just a number of places that you can get into terrain that's in the mid 20-degree slope angle range. So it's kind of fun enough to ski down, but it's not steep enough to avalanche. But I'm constantly on lookout for new mellow terrain, especially in years like this year where I've gotten into avalanche terrain maybe one day out of 30 or 40 days that I've been in the backcountry this year. And so I'm constantly looking for new kind of fun places to check out that are non-avalanche terrain. One of the challenges is that sometimes you need to be on north-facing terrain to get good snow. And a lot of the north-facing terrain here that's low angle and doesn't avalanche is usually too thick of timber, so that can be kind of a challenge. So satellite imagery can be pretty helpful for determining if something is too thickly treed versus something that's open enough to ski through. Burn terrain is actually a pretty good place to explore, as people have found out on the backside of Baldy. So yeah, it just takes a little homework using mapping tools and using some satellite imagery, and that can be helpful. Or having a snowmobile is pretty nice too, because it's really easy to enjoy mellow terrain on a snowmobile when the powder's deep.
Great. Well, if anyone else has other questions, you can squeak those in here real quick. We're just about at the end of our time here. Chris, I was just remembering, and I think an acronym that Jeremy told me that you had taught in an avalanche class a while ago, the OPP, stick to the old people POW, and you can ski as an old person.
Powder. Hopefully, I've used that in a few forecasts. Hopefully I never offended anybody, but I think the concept is a really, really good one to think about.
Yep, exactly. What can you do to keep riding that powder as long as possible? And having a snowmobile, I'll tell you, so fun in the flats for this year in particular. Awesome. Well, looks like we're wrapped up here on questions. There's a few thank yous coming in. So thanks to Chris for taking the time to put this presentation together. Definitely learned a lot. And I hope everybody else that was watching got to have some good takeaways that we can go into the rest of the season with. Be sure again to mark your calendars for the next Digging Deeper on February 17th with Scott Savage talking about the persistent and deep slab avalanches that we will be dealing with here in our area. And be sure to submit some observations if you see anything out in the mountains on the website at sawtoothavalanche.com. You can also sign up for the emails there to get the daily forecast delivered to your inbox every single morning. And again, tag us in social media to help spread the word of what you're seeing so that all of your friends can stay in tune with what's going on in the backcountry and with the avalanches. So thanks again so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And we hope to see you all out there in the backcountry and at our next Digging Deeper series. So thanks, Chris. And also I want to send at the very end another huge thank you to all the forecasters for their work, especially in this last week, Scott, Ethan, Ben, and Chris. And I haven't given her a shout out on here before, but Stephanie Eisenbarth, as the executive director of the Friends of the Avalanche Center, puts in a ton of work behind the scenes, and Stacy Ward as the education coordinator, and the entire board. Thanks so much for all of the work that you all do. So with that, we will wrap up tonight and see you all next time.
Thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a great winter.